You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Ever since Charlie Kirk's untimely death and tragic assassination in September of last year, the more Trump-friendly, populist wing of the right has been in a slow descent of chaos. I don't think I had truly appreciated to what degree Kirk was holding these disparate forces together, as unsavory individuals like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, and many others have been making names for themselves, behaving as buffoons and spreading conspiracy theories. But just who is this populist right? It can be kind of difficult to get your arms around what group of people are we actually talking about here. I'm your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me in this conversation, here to help us make sense of it all, is Stephanie Slade, senior editor at Reason. While Stephanie herself is a fusionist, not a nationalist populist, she has nonetheless spent these past many years embedding herself in these various organizations and movements, trying to understand what makes them tick. And so I thought she would be the perfect person to talk to get our heads around just what exactly is going on. Who are we talking about in these various groups? So with that, I give you my conversation with Stephanie Slade.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
So I wanted to start here. Dr. George Nash, in his book, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945, and man, he needed a shorter title. It's an excellent book. It's a beefy title. But he is talking, of course, about the Buckley Reaganite conservatism. I guess you wouldn't even call it the Reaganite conservatism because the book originally ended in the 1970s before we even had the term. But he begins by making this point that conservatism, the conservative intellectual movement he's arguing about, is not a monolith. He talks about these various strands that eventually form the fusionists movement we understand today. Not coalitional, of course, but from the traditionalist to the libertarian-minded to the anti-communist, hawkish elements, and all these thoughts and ideas merged together. But that in reality, these are a lot of different disparate thoughts and ideas that take a while to sort of coalesce and form. The reason I'm bringing that up is because what we're talking about today, of course, is what's kind of the new right, the alt-right, the dissident right. It's got a bunch of different names. But I wanted to start here with this basic concept because I like to start conversations by defining things, but I want to give you an opportunity to define the new right also as not a monolith, right? That is a lot of disparate groups. But could we begin with, is there some unifying idea or ideas that we could simply say, well, this is what, largely speaking, makes up the new right? And then maybe we can talk about the ways in which the various groups differ from each other.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you used as an alternative dissident right, because actually in the book that I've been working on, that's the term that I chose to use to sort of capture as an umbrella term to capture all of these different factions and groups and figures who are essentially on the illiberal or anti-liberal or liberal skeptic side of the conservative movement. And of course, some people are going to be going, aren't all conservatives by definition not liberals.
Right.
But by this, I don't mean they're not on the left. All conservatives are not on the left by definition. But many conservatives are classically liberal, right? They still believe in things like limited government, rule of law, free markets, these classically liberal values. The dissident right or the new right are those who are either skeptical or outright reject liberalism, right? They say, we tried your limited government, your free market economics, and we don't like the outcomes. And we think that conservatives need to to pursue an alternative path. They need to embrace, usually what they'll say is embrace a muscular state. We need to be willing to wield state power, to acquire, seize, wield state power, use it against our enemies, use it to try to shape society and orient society towards the things that we believe are good. And this is just a different approach to politics than the one that sort of came out of what you were talking about, the sort of 20th century William F. Buckley Jr., Ronald Reagan era conservatism, which was very much about, again, rule of law, limited government, not all about acquiring power and wielding power, but about how do we limit power was really one of the driving ideas there, because of a belief that that was how you pursue the common good. And these new dissident right types, for all their differences, mostly think, yeah, that didn't work, and we're tired of that. And we think that that allowed a situation to emerge in which the left has dominated our society, and we're not going to take it anymore.
It's ironic, I think, the degree to which, and this may be something we return to again and again in this conversation, the degree to which some of these terms are borrowed by various groups on the left. The idea that liberalism did not deliver on the outcomes we wanted, right? That, if you were to just use that phrase, I would immediately think, oh, we're talking about the wokest left, or we're talking about the Marxist left, or someone who says, this free society that we live in is not providing the outcomes we want, and therefore there's something wrong with the free society. It's not a mechanism or a tool or a process whereby we can hope to achieve our goals. We're actually questioning the entire thing. I'm One of the things I think I'm struggling with in this conversation, and I'm sure you've bumped into this also, is because this group is not so monolithic. You end up There are a lot of people on the I'll use the term dissident right also, because I kind of like that. But part of my problem with the new right is that at one point the Buckleyites were the new right. And so it's like, well, what point in history, who's the new right and who's a lot of the new right sounds like the old right to me. So I think dissident right might be helpful because it's kind of in conflict or against the dead consensus, if you will, type right. So I want to be careful that we don't always do a guilt by association, because this is such a large group. There are odious elements within it. Let's just get up, straight up Nick Fuentes. I have very little sympathy for his viewpoint. Some of the others, Curtis Yarvin, I think he's maybe the best spokesperson for a certain voice of the dissident right. But I find his arguments not only unpersuasive, I don't know why we take him as serious as we do often. And then there are others, Patrick Janine, Yoram Mazzoni, who I don't agree with, but they seem to be very intelligent people making very intelligent arguments that I can, debate and intertwine myself with. And so I don't know if this makes sense or not, but do you bump into that sometimes, that we're talking about such a desperate group that it's difficult to say, here's what qualifies them, like, because even when you start to critique them, it sounds like, well, wait, are we accusing Yoram Mazzoni of being a neo-Nazi? That seems kind of weird.
Right. Right. No, yes, this is, and I think a lot of people who aren't maybe quite as deep into it as you or me, have a tendency to sort of lump them all together and then say things that are a little bit sloppy, like they're all anti-Semites or they all reject the American founding. Well, the truth is that there are anti-Semites, and there are a bunch of people who are critical of or reject. They say that we need a new American founding because the old American founding was too liberal, and so we
Right.
need to reject it and refound the country on Judeo-Christian or white European values. There are those figures, there are those voices, but they're not. It's not monolithic, as you say. So it's really important, I think, to be a little more careful when you're talking about what's going on here. And even in my writing, and in my book, I break out the sort of dissident right into three broad camps. I talk about the post-liberals, or the sort of, I call them theocons, the more religiously inflected ones, like the Patrick Deneen's. I talk about the national conservatives. That's Yoram Hazony, that's Orrin Cass, the people who are more interested in sort of a populist economic alternative to libertarianism. And then I talk about the neo-reactionaries, and that would be Curtis Yarvin and his ilk. And they're not all the same. And even when I've done that breaking out, I'm still having to really simplify. Right? I'm still having to lump a bunch of people under those.
Yeah, I actually wrote in preparation for the conversation, I came up with 8 groups. So I appreciate you breaking it down even further for us.
You certainly can break them down more. And so there's a distinction between the Catholic integralists and the Protestant Christian nationalists, right? I sort of put them both under the theocon or post-liberal umbrella. And so there's lots of I talk in my. I've written about Bronze Age pervert. I don't know whether your listeners are fully up to speed on that. That may sound a little crazy what I just said, but yeah, this is a sort of pseudonymous account online who has a huge following of young, especially Gen Z, young men on the right, and he writes under the pseudonym Bronze Age pervert. And I put him under the neo-reactionary umbrella, but of course his view is actually often referred to as vitalism, which is another sort of substrain of this, which is all about how you need to be manly and masculine and be willing to. There are certain people who are born to rule and to wield power, and there are other people who are born to be, slaves, natural slaves. It's very Nietzschean, and so there's a lot going on here. But I do think that if I was going to give sort of a shorthand, a sort of shortcut to understanding what unites all of the dissident right voices, it is a rejection, or at the least extreme, it's just a questioning or a suspicion of liberalism, classical liberalism. And in many cases, it's an outright rejection. The idea that we need to replace the liberal order with something post-liberal or something illiberal, non-liberal, anti-liberal.
Yeah, and I'm struggling with how much of this can of worms should I open here, because I kind of my standard line as a, say, classical Burkean conservative. I don't call myself a classical liberal. I call myself a classical conservative. Is that historically speaking, prior to socialism showing up on the scene, it does in fact seem that the classical conservative tradition found itself as sort of against the prevailing liberal views. Not that they were out of alignment in all ways. A lot of ways, classical. Part of the problem is I think these are category errors. I don't think they're exactly on par with each other, so it's hard to say that they're either for or against each other. But it seems like, from my perspective, oftentimes the conservatives' position is to see the liberal as their opponent up until the point anyone else sees the liberal as their opponent. Then they're like, whoa, wait a minute. We don't want to go that far, right? And I'm not trying to out you, but you being libertarian, I being conservative, like the conservative traditional argument is and I'm not trying to describe views to you, but like traditionally the conservatives would disagree with the anthropology of liberalism, right? Of some of the notions of the state of nature kind of arguments of how society came to be.
I hear what you're saying, and I think there's some truth to that. But I also think it's important to complicate it. So, for example, you identify as a Burkean conservative. Burke was a Whig. Okay, he was an early proto-liberal.
Oh,
He was,
sure, that's
and
fair.
right, and so he was a supporter of the American Revolution, and he was a critic of the British Crown in many instances. And so I think that it's just. But he was also, of course, even more famously, a critic of the French Revolution, because he saw a distinction between sort of healthy liberalism, and something that has sort of broken free of all constraint and become become a sort of Frankenstein's monster. And the French Revolution, which was built on this sort of anthropology that you're describing, I think that you were alluding to, was something that he recognized immediately as problematic, and he wasn't tempted down that path. But he was not somebody who was like, he was not the same sort of blood and soil thrown in altar conservative that sometimes I think people today remember him as, or when people talk about a sort of traditionalist understanding of conservatism. I think of Kirk, who was one of the people who helped bring Burke back into the conversation in America, and he said, Burke was a liberal and he was a conservative. He was a conservative because he was a liberal, and he was a liberal because he was a conservative.
Right,
So I really
right.
think that it's possible in a sort of, again, I'm on the one hand, I'm simplifying when I'm talking about the new right, and now I'm trying to desimplify the way we talk about conservatism. So I recognize that. But that's, I think it's important to realize that those strains were there within the conservative tradition all along.
No, I think I think that is entirely fair, and that's why I say sometimes I wonder how much of this is a category error, because I am a classical liberal by some understandings and definitions. I would have to be. And by the way, I always applaud a person who points out that a lot of people get Burke wrong. A lot of people get Kirk wrong. I think there's a lot of ways in which he is seen as sort of the father of the of parts of the dissident right unfairly, in my view. But we can move on from that. I guess I meant more of a sense of when I read people like Patrick Deneen, I see where part of his critiques of the, let's call it, classical liberal tradition is coming from, that I, as a Burkean, say, okay, I get this. I understand. And part of it is that classical liberalism, and this is not a fault of classical liberalism, I just think it was never meant to be more, is can only get you so far in life, right? There's a lot of ways. You and I are both Christians. I think we draw a lot of meaning and purpose, hopefully, more out of that than out of the the mechanisms of a classical liberal tradition, as wonderful that is, and as much as it's worth defending. I don't want to do the whole song and dance on the Irving Kristol "Two Cheers for Capitalism," that it can't, it maximizes human freedom and that it provides for prosperity, but it doesn't necessarily create its own virtues. But it's a form of that argument, if you will. And so there's a lot of ways in which the beginning pieces of like the Deneen arguments are like, okay, I get this, I see where you're going here. And then when he starts criticizing Madison, I'm like, I think you just don't understand Madison. Like, I think the founders had a more profound view than your kind of simplification here. And then when he, and let's move on from why liberalism failed, sorts offers the alternative. This is where I really start to get nervous, because I'm like, look, now we're talking about a utopic vision of what could be, right? These are unproven theories about, liberalism has failed. I don't think that's true, but just sort of the assertion it's failed. And there exists out there something, maybe from historical records or maybe something that had never actually existed, that is somehow superior to it. And to me, that sounds extremely anti-Burkean. Extremely like, let's just create these things whole cloth. And again, I can get a Patrick Deneen, he's a respectable, intelligent person, but I think that's kind of where the reason I'm saying all this is I want to acknowledge the messiness of it, if you will, that I think a lot of times the dissident right are borrowing, and you would know this better than I would, borrowing arguments that start you down a, say, Buckley-type conservative path, but at some point they push it a little bit too radical, a little bit too utopian, a little bit too theoretical in a direction that leads you to something very unconservative.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, both in terms of the theory and the history, and in terms of what we're seeing today. So on the sort of theory and history side, I'm all about sort of trying to resurrect the idea of fusionism. And fusionism basically is the idea that liberalism also needs the sort of Judeo-Christian moral anchor, right? They need to be fused together in order to be the basis of a good society. And so liberty needs virtue, virtue needs liberty. This is fusionism, and that's sort of, this is my way of acknowledging, like, yes, if you're saying liberalism it's on its own is not enough, I don't disagree with you. It's not enough. We need to have some sense of, okay, once we have limited government, once we have sort of protected our individual rights and liberties, what do we do with our freedom to build a good life? What does that look like, right? That's a really important question. I don't think, some liberals might disagree with me, I don't think that liberalism answers that question. I think we have to look elsewhere. And so we should be looking to tradition, and we should be looking to religion and philosophy to answer those questions of, how do we live a good life? What does that look like? What are our moral obligations to each other? Those sorts of things. So I agree, liberalism by itself is not enough, but I would say liberalism is essential and non-negotiable. It needs to be married to the sort of tradition. Whereas I think way too many of the dissident right just want to throw it out completely. They say it failed, we throw it away, we want something else instead. So that's a pretty big, again, a distinction on the sort of theoretical level. And then in terms of what's going on right now in our politics, I think you're right to, and they're right to note that, like, our current system is not a utopia. The current sort of quote unquote liberal order is not producing outcomes that we can all be perfectly happy with. There's a lot of injustice and there's a lot of failings in our current system that the new right is reacting against. I just wrote recently a piece for Reason about all the ways in which the left, the political left in America, broadly speaking, has itself embraced illiberalism. We tend to use the word liberal to mean left of center, but my argument is, in fact, they rejected things like free speech through sort of run amok cancel culture. They rejected the idea of individualism, and people should be judged based on their individual virtues and accomplishments through what they has often been called intersectional identity politics, right? Where you, in fact, actually are judged based on what demographic categories and labels you're able to claim. This is not individualistic.
It becomes this tedious battle of everybody trying to one-up each other in which privileged or unprivileged group they belong to.
Exactly right. And so all these ways in which the left has rejected itself or abandoned liberalism, now the right is reacting against that feeling of injustice that they're, I think, correctly observing. So I don't want to suggest that everything is perfect right now. In fact, I think there's a lot of problems with sort of the modern society as we know it. But again, the distinction is, do you want to abandon liberalism, or do you want to try to revive and protect and sort of resuscitate and defend liberalism?
Yeah, and in my I think I may not be doing as good a job as host of trying to start with the simple definition and let's expand to the complexity, because I think we keep oscillating between complex and and simplification. Again, my fault for I keep opening these can of worms, but let me return to, because I think you have a very useful. Well, let's break the dissident right into these three broad categories. Would you mind? Let's just spend a bit of time on each three. I've got it written down here. The post liberals. I mean, there are terms we hear all the time, right? Post liberals, NatCons or national conservatives, and then the neo reactionary, which is probably, in my view, the most interesting, maybe not most persuasive, but most alarming of the three. But can we start with the first? Just who are the post liberals and how would they differentiate themselves from, say, the other two?
Yeah, post-liberal was a term. I mean, I think there was a moment when it could be. I, in fact, was even using it in my writing as the umbrella term to capture all of these different dissident right factions. But then there was a moment a few years ago when the Catholic integralists or the Catholic anti-liberals or skeptics or of liberalism, people like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law School, they claimed it for their own, and they launched a blog called the Post-Liberal Order, where they were essentially arguing for this thing that could be called a sort of light Catholic integralism or a political Catholicism, and they were using the word post-liberal to describe that. And so I think that
Was this,
now,
sorry to interrupt, but was this around the same moment? Because wasn't it a couple of years ago that the National Conservative Convention sort of for lack of better words, excommunicated the Catholic integralists, or is that not a fair?
Um, I would tell the story a little bit differently. You're right that in the early years of the national conservatism conferences and movement, the post liberals were there. In many cases, they were invited. Patrick Deneen spoke on the main stage at the very first conference in 2019, and then there was a moment when they stopped. There was a break. There was a divorce between these two camps. I don't think it was as much that the NatCons excommunicated the post liberals as it was that the post liberals um they felt like they stood for something different and they no longer wanted to be associated with it. So that I think was that's how I remember it happening more, was that some of the post liberals who in 2021, Sohrab Ahmari, who's another one of these Catholic writers, was one of the headliners at the National Conservatism Conference. And then a few months later or a year later, he came out and he was like, nationalism is a failure, and and you guys, there's too much going on here in the NatCon movement that I don't believe in. And there was like, and he also his focus. He actually, it was interesting. He said, "You guys are too focused on the culture war and not focused enough on essentially progressive economics, populist economics, abandoning libertarian economics." He wanted more focus on the economics.
Well, in all fairness, Sorba Mari's on is his fifth major ideological reconversion at this point.
Yes, he's been on a journey for sure. But so yeah, so there was a moment when these camps were not as easy to identify, and then there's been over time there's been a sort of clarification, crystallization as okay, the Catholic post liberals, and now there are people who identify as Protestant post liberals or Christian nationalists. And,
Yeah.
obviously different people prefer different labels, and they can mean different things, but they're all what I think is important about all of them is that they are all religiously motivated. They're Christians in basically all these cases, and they care about virtue. So when I talk about virtue, I talk about liberty and virtue as being mutually reinforcing, and we need to care about both of them. They care a lot about virtue, and they think that liberty is interfering with the attainment, right? That too much liberty in our society is getting in the way of people being able to live virtuous lives and good lives. And so they're not rejecting both of my pillars. They're saying if we care about the one pillar so much that we think the other one is undermining it. So we want less of the libertarian economics. We want less of the individual liberty, the individualism. We want more strong rule by a good leader who will, maintain order, will set guardrails in our society that will take the temptation to sin or to vice off the table for people as much as possible. This is what they want. So they want laws that will force stores to close on Sunday so people won't have to work on Sunday so they can observe the Sabbath more easily. They want laws that will make it harder to get a divorce because they think that divorce is, most people are abandoning their marriages, and so instead of moving towards no fault divorce where it's very easy to get divorced, they want to go back to a system where it's harder legally to get a divorce, right? In some cases, the most extreme cases, folks under this camp have want to reintegrate church and state. They believe in a confessional state. They perhaps think, they perhaps think there should even be religious tests to hold public office, to vote, to serve on a jury. They essentially, again, in the most extreme cases, there are voices who say, if you are not a baptized Christian, you should not be a citizen in our society. This is a Christian society, and you should be a baptized Christian in order to have full citizenship rights. And what that means is that, in particular, Jews and Muslims would not have the same rights as everyone else. So this is, again, I'm not saying this is a widespread view, but it has been articulated by people within this camp. And it is sort of the logical endpoint of this way of thinking, I think. And so it is a thing that these less radical post-liberals have to grapple with, is, well, if there are people in our camp who think this is where our logic leads, do we agree? Do we not agree? If we don't, what is the limiting principle on the things we're arguing? I think that's the sort of main challenge that they face, because clearly this idea of denying full citizenship rights to certain segments of the population based on their religion is not going to fly in a society like ours. It's not going to be politically popular. It's not going to get passed through a democratic action. It would have to be
Right.
imposed by the top down.
Yeah. Why am I blanking here, Stephanie? I'm sure you can help me out here. Who is the guy? He is not a Catholic integralist. He's more Christian nationalist. Last name Wolf, I believe.
Stephen Wolfe, yeah.
Stephen Wolf, thank you. I heard a very interesting conversation between him and Ross Douthat recently on Ross's excellent podcast, Interesting Times. And I was surprised. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Stephen Wolf's argument is insane, but I was surprised how insightful and well-spoken and how much he had actually thought through some of these issues. And I get this and to me, that actually makes it scarier, rather than just some
They really mean
screwball
it.
out there. They really mean it, because one of the things he seemed to acknowledge, because Ross Douthat kept bringing up some of these points, is there's almost this sort of evolutionary approach, or necessary kind of slow, methodical approach to it. How far can we push this? Maybe that is the end point. Maybe that is the goal. But let's first focus on making America more recognized as a Christian nation, and then maybe eventually we could get to the point where Muslims and Jews aren't allowed to hold public office. Those weren't exactly his words, but it was sort of where I saw he was like, he recognized, yeah, of course we can't elect a Christian dictator and just impose all these things, but maybe we could nudge us that direction. And I'm wondering, because I'm Protestant, you're Catholic, and so my broadly speaking, let's call it this sort of theocratic approach, if you will, has a different flavor for me with the circles sort of I run in, because usually when we talk about this from the more serious traditional voices on this, were sort of the Brent Bozels, who argued this against Frank Meyer years ago. Virtue trumps liberty. Why are we wedding these things together as if they're co-equal or mutually reinforcing? But I'm curious, because what I often see, again, I'm taking Stephen Wolfe off the table because I think he's a serious guy. He's very intelligent, very wrong, but very intelligent, making an interesting, serious argument. What I more often see are those who reject this sort of Christian nationalist label. They would consider it almost a libel. But they're always like Christian nationalist friendly or open to debate, or they're just asking questions. And kind of what I see their end goal in mind is not so much pursuit of virtue as like a theocratic dictatorship, but it's sort of this ill-defined notion that somehow if we could slap enough Merry Christmases on things out there, if we could turn America into Branson, Missouri, if we could turn us into a Norman Rockwell painting, that somehow is going to fix something. And it doesn't even seem to be all that deeply theologically rooted. It's almost more of a what I'll call pop culture Christian Americana. This is how we've created entire industries within. And again, you have to forgive me. This is my Protestant upbringing to the Christian bookstores, the Christian music industry, the Christian entertainment, for lack of better words, industry. I'm not sure how much it infiltrates Catholicism, but certainly within the Protestant group, it churns out an enormous amount of really crappy entertainment content over. I mean, one of the recent stories was apparently AI produced a worship song that hit #1 recently.
Wow.
And my first thought was, well, maybe that shows how artificial a lot of Christian pop has become. Anyhow, I'll get off that point. But I guess what I'm saying is, some of this doesn't seem to be so much a serious theological / political agenda. It seems like the masses are mostly have a very poor idea in mind of what a, air quotes, Christian nation would look like.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And when we're talking not about the intellectuals, I tend to focus on the intellectual currents in my work. But absolutely, when we're talking about things like what motivated people to vote for Donald Trump,
They weren't reading Stephen Wolfe.
exactly, right. But what you find is that there was this great survey that was taken right after the 2020 election. I look back at the survey all the time. I cite it all the time because it was so helpful. It was conducted by the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and it was just a survey of people who voted for Trump in 2020. And what I found was when you asked them about various kinds of like economic policy questions, they were divided. There was not a unanimity among Trump voters on even things like whether international trade is good or bad for America. There were a lot of most Trump voters said trade is good for America, actually, which is maybe not what you would think if you were just listening to the intellectuals. But where there was like almost like total agreement, like 90% agreement among people who voted for Donald Trump, was on this slate of questions that sort of point to cultural or identity-based grievance, a siege mentality. So it was things like Christianity is under attack in America today. It was we are losing sight of the things that make this country great. It was I'm afraid that white people are facing increasing discrimination. It was the mainstream media is just an arm of the Democratic Party. It was the sense that like something has gone wrong in our society such that people like me and people like me, we feel like we are under threat. We're being told that we're not even welcome in our own society. We're being told that like we should be blamed for all the ills of America because of the color of our skin, and we're being told that we're not allowed to hold the Christian views that we have held for millennia. That suddenly it makes us a bigot, and we're no longer welcome in polite society. We can be driven out of our jobs, by an online mob. Like, we're afraid if we say the wrong word, we're going to be canceled and humiliated. Like, there was just this sense of feeling under siege that these people, again, almost like 90% across the board, were all in agreement on those questions. And I think that that goes to show a sort of, again, a sense of like what's happening in our politics more broadly is a reaction against the leftist politics that have created that siege mentality, that have made people feel like I'm so angry about being made to feel this way that I just want somebody who will fight back on my behalf. And Donald Trump, if nothing else, he will fight for me, right? I might not like everything about him, but I know that he's on my side against that. He's not going to stand for that, and he will make it safe to say a Merry Christmas again, right? This is not, it obviously was never unsafe to say Merry Christmas, but they felt like actually they don't know at any given moment, if they say the wrong phrase, if they use the wrong wording, that runs, that runs against some sort of new woke piety, that they might have their life destroyed for reasons that they don't even understand. And people they were really concerned about that. And so there is that is, I think, a thing that is underlying the more broad-based grassroots political side of what's happening on the right and the center, even the center left. I think, we saw a lot of people cross over from the center left to vote for Trump in the last election, sort of unexpectedly, right? Including racial minorities, that a lot of people did not see that coming. And I think that is all part of this same phenomenon of reaction against again this like illiberal left-wing identity politics that went too far.
Yeah, and it's a difficult conversation to talk about too, because on the one hand, I want to fully acknowledge the left has gone too far, and maybe I should say the left, because there's plenty of people I know on the left that said, "Yeah, that's crazy." Pockets of the long march through the institutions, sort of cultural Marxism, if you will, has gone too far. And there are certainly unending examples, anecdotal stories, and all sorts of things reported in the media of the various ways in which people have been harmed by this broader cancel culture of the left. While simultaneously, I think there's a lot of people on the, let's call it the right, who have capitalized on it in a way that I find silly. We're not all under siege in the way they sort of depict this. And it does seem to me often to be one of the major dividing grounds between the Trump skeptic or the pro-Trump movement, if you will, is the degree to which they have sort of a Flight 93 mindset. Like, are we on the brink of collapse? That is perhaps another, as I'm saying this out loud, it occurs to me, that is another hour-long conversation I might have you back on sometime, because I've never found a shorthand way to work through that. And you're welcome to respond to that, but I do want to, I do want to move to the NatCons as differentiated
Yeah.
from the post-liberals too. So again, you're welcome to respond to that, or we can just shelf it and talk about the second group.
Yeah, let's move on to the NatCons. So the National Conservatives, or NatCons, this again is an umbrella term, but I think the most prominent NatCon would be Yoram Hazony, who's an Israeli-American political philosopher who founded the National Conservatism Conferences back in 2019. And it's I initially thought that this was gonna be mostly a group that was focused on economic policy and economic populism. If you went to that first conference in 2019, there was a whole debate between Orr and Cass arguing for why we need industrial policy, right? Versus a more libertarian, Richard Ryan, a more libertarian conservative who was arguing for free markets. And so I thought, okay, the difference between the national conservatives and the sort of old school fusionist Reaganite conservatives is going to be on economic policy. So the NatCons are very anti-immigration. They're much more willing to have government intervene in the economy to try to bring about better, fairer, what they would consider to be better, fairer outcomes that favor, white working class men, for example, that allow people to raise a family on a single income so that women can stay home, so that we can have more kids. They care a lot about that issue. Tend to be very skeptical of immigration. Um, but it's sort of populist economics. What we have seen over time, though, is that has somewhat been subsumed into the culture war. That's just what I've observed as somebody who has gone to all of these national conservatism conferences over the last 6 years, is that more and more, yes, those populist economic, sort of what I would consider progressive or left-wing economic positions are there and they're being defended. But there's a lot more of it bleeds over into both of the post-liberal theocon side of things. In fact, Yoram Hazony, of all people, despite being Jewish, has argued that we need to be a Christian country and we need to bring reading of the Bible and study of the Bible back into our public school classrooms and things like that. And it has bled over into what we're going to get to in a minute, which is the neo-reactionary, more will to power, just pure culture war. Just we need to destroy the left at all costs. That's what matters. They have been trying to impose their will upon us, and we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to fight back using whatever levers we can get our hands on, whether those are governmental, whether those involve social pressure, whether they involve lawfare, right? Abusing the legal system to go after our enemies using the power of the state. There was an entire panel at the 2 years ago at the National Conservatism Conference with 4 eminent conservative lawyers in which they were talking about why conservatives need to be willing to embrace lawfare. It was a pro lawfare panel. All 4, there was not a single voice arguing against it. So again, this is an idea of an expansive use of state power and using whatever levers are available and not being constrained by sort of norms and etiquette and best practices or legal procedures. Even the idea that it's not okay to use the Justice Department. We're saying this right now in the Trump administration. The idea that it was not okay to use the Justice Department for political ends, right? To use the power of the state to go after the president's political opponents. That's one of the foundations of classical liberalism, or of sort of rule of law, that you don't even have to call yourself a liberal, but if you believe in rule of law, that's part of it. And that has been thrown out the door, and it's being justified by folks on the dissident right broadly, but including in the natcon camp. So the main thing, though, I guess, if you're going to try to distinguish them by what do they believe, it is that they believe in the nation state. They believe that the country is made up of a certain set of people that have a certain set of interests, that our government should be looking out for the interests of those people. And that means being willing to say, no, you can't come here. You're not us. We are a certain set of people, and we're going to protect the character and the fabric of the culture. Some people would say that in a non-racialist way, and they would say anybody can come here. An American can be any race or ethnicity, but you just can't bring in huge numbers of people from a different culture and expect that won't change our culture. Others would say, no, we are a white European Christian nation, and it needs to be kept that way. So we need to care a lot about the sort of purity of the demographic makeup of our population, and we should be willing to use state power to protect that. We should be willing to use the state power to set economic policy that look out for our workers again. So that's the industrial policy, the tariffs, that sort of thing. But it's saying we should be willing to do things that benefit our country, even if they harm other people, and we shouldn't be worried about that because the nation is the most important sort of unit of measurement in the world. And I think that's there are some kernels of truth to that. But it's important to realize the ways in which it can go wrong, both by becoming obviously hostile towards foreigners and towards the idea that if all we care about is what's good for America, then why can't we be invading other countries and stealing their resources and enslaving their people, right? That's the way the world worked for many thousands of years. And it sort of seems like they're returning to the logic that fuels that sort of way of operating in the world. Why can't the strong countries just subjugate the weak countries, if all that matters is us versus them? And then the other way that it goes wrong, and this is the thing that I've been more focused on in my writing since the very beginning, is the way it's anti-individualistic, because it places the so-called interests or the common good or the national interest ahead of the right of individuals to make decisions for themselves about how to live their lives. If the government can come in and tell you, you're not allowed to hire a foreign worker even if you think it's in the best interest of your company, or you're not allowed to trade with a foreign country even if you think that that's in the best interest of your, providing for your family at the lowest cost because they want you to be buying American even if it costs more. They're essentially saying the national interest or the public, the common good is more important than your right as an individual to decide how to live your life, and we're going to tell you how to live in these various ways. So it's anti-individualistic. By being nationalistic, it's anti-individualistic, and that is a real problem, I think, for me as a libertarian, obviously. But it should be sort of setting off alarms for a lot of people.
I appreciate you saying that some of these arguments contain a kernel of truth, because this is one of the things that I find the NatCons slippery often. Not all of them, but some of them pretty slippery, because it sort of begins with things like, okay, I think we can both agree on that. Like, I can agree that it's in the nation's interest to have some control over who is or is not immigrating here. I can agree that maybe some trade policy makes sense in terms of, are there certain authoritarian regimes that are bent on our destruction that maybe we have some sort of national interest, say, of limiting the individual's capacity? Yes, there's all sorts of ways in which, okay, I see where you're getting there. The most common argument I think within this group is the sort of, they started it first. The left has already engaged in a lawfare. The left has already broken the system, so we're just doing the same thing. And I do think there's a degree to which it makes sense to be like, okay, well, if your opponent has truly broken the system, that's something to be mindful of, and maybe there are ways that we could counter that. But I don't think the conclusion is I should celebrate Donald Trump pardoning the January Sixers, or we should be blowing boats out of the Caribbean because, somehow that's pretend to be in our national interest, or that we're only allowing Christians into the nation. It's sort of this, like, I get their beginning kernels and there are truths to that. I don't want to say they take it too far, because I think there's also some ways in which we just fundamentally disagree on some founding principles, if you will. But I don't. Is that a fair statement that some of these are, say, slippery individuals to kind of try to tangle with?
They definitely can be, and of course, it's a whole movement of people who are not all reading from the same hymn book, so it's hard. So they don't all necessarily always agree amongst themselves. And again, and to give credit. I think there are some things that they would argue that a full-on libertarian would be perfectly happy to endorse. So, for example, one of the ways that you can you can sort of defend nationalism is as defending the right of the nation to make decisions for itself, as opposed to transferring making powers to supranational or transnational institutions like the UN, or for in the British context, the EU, right? So these institutions that are actually much farther away from the individual and much less likely to understand the conditions on the ground in a particular place. We don't want to be empowering them to make decisions and imposing decisions on whole huge swath of the world. We at least should be asking questions about whether that's a good idea. The nationalists are very opposed to that, and I think they should be. I think those are really reasonable questions to ask, and most libertarians, in fact, are opposed to the UN, right? Like
Most traditionalist conservatives have been
right.
opposed to that.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I guess my point is to say, not that they're wrong about every single thing that they believe, but about the
Right.
things that they're right about. You don't actually have to abandon traditional conservatism or fusionist, classical liberalism in order to acknowledge that. Like, this is just the position that most people on the right in America have had all along. Not everyone, but most people. Most people have been on this side of this issue of, because, and again, and it's legitimate, because you're moving decision-making power farther away from the individual. I want to move it closer to the individual. And then if we can both agree on that, then I can turn to the NatCon and my nationalist friends and say, why do you want to stop at the national level? Why not the local level? Why not the family level? Like, why are we going to empower the nation in this particular way? If that means overruling the right of individuals and families and communities to make decisions that are right for them.
Yeah. God, there's so much more I could say here, but let me, for the interest of just giving everyone fair time here, let's move on to what I had hinted at. I find to be the most fascinating and terrifying, maybe of the three. The do you say reactionaries, reacts, or how would you define the third group?
Yes, I call them the neo-reactionaries or neo-reactionary right, and that's a term that I've borrowed. I mean, I didn't come up with that. That was a Curtis Yarvin term. In fact, they use the letters NRX as shorthand for neo-reactionary. Sometimes you'll see that online, and that's what we're talking about. Is this neo-reactionary sort of camp or cohort within the dissident right?
So how, and they're, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like this is the group that, unless you're a chronically online person, you're just going to get bits and pieces of this, right? I mean, you can know all about the post liberals. You can know all about I find people that are, say, within the traditionalist camp that have podcasts and write books and speak very seriously, to have had interactions with the NatCons and the post liberals and all these high minded debate. Like, it seems like this is the group that you kind of have to get down in the dirt and the mud and grind to really even know what's going on here.
That's right. Although one of the scary things is that actually I think that this camp probably has the greatest influence in our politics, much larger influence than most of us realize, for a few reasons. One is that my sense of the matter is that the young conservatives who are very online for obvious reasons tend to be, this is who these are the people they're watching on YouTube. These are the podcasts they're listening to, the blogs they're reading. So it's very much capturing the sort of imagination of the next generation of up and coming people on the right. And so that's a little scary. And the other thing is that they're actually friends with people who are now in positions of power. So a lot of people who are sort of acolytes of this way of thinking, and I should define it in a minute, but are now staffing the Trump administration, or who are working on Capitol Hill as staffers to Republican members of Congress. We know that J.D. Vance, the vice president, is somebody who knows and is friendly with and has read Curtis Yarvin, who is sort of one of the earliest pioneers of this way of thinking. And so it has made its way into the halls of power at this point. And so that's I think a really important thing to recognize, even if most of us, if you're just watching Fox News and reading the newspaper on, whatever, you may never have encountered some of these ideas, but they have a lot of influence right now in our politics through the young people, especially young men. So how do we define this? Again, I'm having to sort of lump a lot of people into one camp, but I think of the neo-reactionaries as people who are, they're often associated with Friedrich Nietzsche, and the idea that, again, that there are sort of natural-born masters or rulers and natural-born slaves or followers, and that some people just have what it takes to rule over everybody else. And what's wrong with our society in the modern world is that the natural-born rulers are being kept artificially down. The system is rigged against the people who are the deserving rulers, and people who are undeserving are being elevated and given power. That's one way to think about it. So it's very power oriented in the sense that you can see that, again, it has ties to a leftist way of thinking. If you think about Marxism or something, where it's all about which class is in power, which is going to be the dominant class, and which is going to be, it's a little bit like that. But so there's within the vitalist camp, which again is this guy named Bronze Age Pervert and people like him, they're very much like, just strong men deserve to rule, and what's wrong with our society is that women have too much power, right? And effeminate men are, and sort of an effeminate way of structuring society is the way that we have allowed our modern society, to evolve. So that it's all about not hurting anybody else's feelings. It's all about things like that, instead of pursuing truth and excellence, which is, in the vitalist way of thinking about the world, the only thing that matters. In Curtis Yarvin's way of writing, and in some of the other corners of this space, it's more about giving somebody power because they think having an absolute ruler who has the ability to make decisions on behalf of everyone is just a more efficient way of structuring society than having this sort of messy democratic bottom-up process where everybody's doing their own thing and we're not all coordinated and there's crime and there's this and there's that. They want strong rules. So sometimes you'll hear the idea that we needed an American Caesar, right? Caesarism, meaning a dictator. We need a strong ruler who can rule over society to restore order and keep order, and that will lead to better outcomes than, again, this sort of messy democratic system that we actually have.
Yeah,
But
Curtis
again,
Yarvin has literally said, if I'm not mistaken, Americans should get used to the idea of a dictator.
yes, yes, that's right. He's often referred to as a monarchist, and
Mhm.
he is very slippery. A lot of these guys are very slippery, right? So he talks about monarchy as being essentially interchangeable with dictatorship, and also that this is all just the same thing as the way you have a CEO who runs a company,
Right.
right? But the point is that there should be somebody at the top who's clearly at the top who gets to make decisions, and really nobody can second guess those decisions. The people at the bottom just follow orders. They're not there to contribute to the decision making. They're just there to do what they're told. And this is so yes, dictator, monarch, national CEO. That's like probably the way he's phrased it. That is most, I think, he's trying to be most appealing to sort of, again, the modern way of thinking. Is all I'm talking about is we need to have a national CEO, because look at how well Apple is run. As big companies are run by CEOs and they're run well and they're efficient, and we should be trying to emulate that as a society. But what it means in practice is something like dictatorship. So something like you have the right to leave if you don't like it here, but you don't have the right to contribute. You don't. There's no voting in his system. This is not a democracy. There's no liberalism. There's no idea of individual rights or freedoms or liberties. It's just a matter of the person at the top who creates order, and that he believes that this will lead to better outcomes. And okay, having said all that, there are some particular concepts that Curtis Yarvin and people like him have coined that I think have touched a nerve. So one of them is the idea of the cathedral, or the idea the idea of the cathedral, which is this idea that actually all of the different institutions in our society currently have been captured by the left. And so even though we don't live under a dictatorship, it feels sometimes like every single source of power in our society is on the other side. For a conservative, you look and you say, how is it that the mainstream media and the universities and Hollywood and and the bureaucracy, the government bureaucracy, like everybody seems to be on the other side of us. Everybody seems to be hostile to us. Why does it feel this way? He coined a sort of story that explains why they're all actually they're not it's not centralized, it's decentralized, but it's basically a decentralized tyranny. And that, I think, strikes a nerve with a lot of people. Feel like, yeah, something does feel off about that, right? Or he coined the term red pilled, which is a reference to the movie The Matrix, to mean if you take the red pill, you sort of are awakened to the reality of the ways in which society is captured by the left. And so if you take the red pill, your eyes are opened and you suddenly realize how bad things really are and that we need to fight back. So these are some ideas that have really they've like reached escape velocity. They're out there. You hear people talk about being red pilled all the time online, and that's coming out of this neo-reactionary discourse.
And I want to be careful I say this, because obviously I feel like both of us attempt to, I don't want to say still man, but at least take arguments serious and then engage with those arguments. But I think it needs to be said, two of the names that occurred to me you left out, and I don't, would you consider, for instance, Nick Fuentes or Andrew Tate to be part of this third category? Is that a
Yeah, they probably can be. Again, we're having to like really cast a wide net at this point.
right?
They're not all the same. But yes, I do actually mention Nick Fuentes as a sort of person in the neo-reactionary space also.
Not that I have anything but disdain, say, for Bronze Age pervert and mention small bug but um, these are the people that are literally advocating things that I think a person could be forgiven for saying, "Oh, this sounds like you're essentially releasing the greater demons of human society, of personality disorders, of the desire of some men to dominate women in a very physical, sexual assault capacity. Let's say to let fly with your sort of racist underlying. I mean, I'm on Team Hitler. I liked Hitler and Stalin. These are in this group contains people who espouse ideas that are not only dangerous and wrong, they're just pure evil in a manner that I think it needs to be stressed is true and is playing to the lowest common denominators of, say, let's say, base impulses, not just of men, but mostly of young men who possibly lack a strong father figure, and maybe that's not even fair to lump them all in that group, say. But this is the group that I find the hardest to sort of take serious without saying, "Are you advocating the rape of women?" You know, let's just call a spade here. Do we have to take your argument serious? Am I wrong to feel that way?
Okay, it's really interesting because one of the things I maybe should have said, and this is especially true with somebody like Nick Fuentes, but it's also true with Bronze Age Pervert. It's also true with Curtis Yarvin, who also blogs under Mencius Millblog. Um, that this is just this is saturated with irony. This culture is so quote unquote ironic, meaning they say things and they kind of wink when they say them, and you're not supposed to know. They want there to be this sort of deniability about whether they mean it or not, right? They want to make you mad. They want to say things that are as offensive as humanly possible. It's a race to be as offensive as possible, in order to get social status in these spaces. Which means you have Nick Fuentes saying some women want to be raped, some women want to have, they want to be beat up. I won't actually repeat the words he used, but he's doing it and he's laughing. And the people who are watching him on YouTube, or actually, I think he's been kicked off YouTube, but whatever he's streaming on, are laughing also because they think it's funny and because they think it's funny to make you mad. They're trying to make you mad. They're trying to be as offensive as possible to get a rise out of the woke left and the normie, Reaganite conservatives, and that's funny to them, and that's part of the shtick. And so it's really hard because it's like a lot of people will ask me, like, do these people mean it? And I'm like, I don't know how to answer that question. Who knows what's in Nick Fuentes' heart? Who knows what he actually believes? What we know is what he says out loud. We know that when you pretend for long enough to be something, when you keep saying these things over and over again, it can't help but affect who you actually are. I mean, I've used the phrase like we are who we pretend to be. If you pretend to be something long enough, you become that thing. And what's really important is we know that even if it starts out as a joke, I think there are a lot of people who are watching online, young people who don't have the maturity to understand what's going on, who are imbibing this, who are consuming it, and who are taking it seriously. And so I think it's not surprising that as we've had these racist, anti-Semitic, I mean, Nick Fuentes is he jokes about the Holocaust. He's a Holocaust denier, but he does it in a jokey way, right? But
Right.
so now we've actually seen young people who are actually much more anti-Semitic, genuinely, much more asking, dabbling in conspiracy theories, questioning whether the Holocaust happened, questioning 9/11. There was a survey recently done that found some pretty disturbing things about what many Republicans, especially young Republicans, their willingness to say, yeah, I don't think the story around the Holocaust is what we've been told. I don't think the story around 9/11 is what we've been told, so on and so forth. So people, it starts out as a joke, but the people consuming it don't necessarily know how to interpret it. They don't have the maturity or the life experience to know how to interpret it, to put it in that context. And so a lot of them just come to believe these things. They come to believe that women are inferior, that men deserve to rule, that, Jews are controlling the world, and so on and so forth. And so I think that that's part of what's happening, is that it starts out, they have this deniability initially because they act like they're just kidding. It's just a joke. Like, don't be, don't you have a sense of humor? Don't you understand that this is just entertainment? But it actually seeps into the culture in this way that has long-term ramifications, and that we're now seeing show up again in actual political positions and views taken on by people on the right.
Okay, so we're not going to have adequate time to do the traditional podcast conversation of, define the problem, you have your airing of grievances, and then you spend the last third, what do you do about it? Not that I would expect, maybe you do, but I wouldn't necessarily expect you to have the one answer that's going to solve all these issues. But I wanted to ask some questions maybe in that direction. And one, are you familiar with, I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name, Alex Kaschet, the host of the Subversive podcast?
I'm not, no.
Okay, she had spoken at NatCon. I follow her every once in a while. She has some of these voices we've been talking about on. I don't know how prominent she is, but like I said, she seems to be an individual who has been plugged into some of this group. And I found it interesting not that long ago that she kind of, I think it was around the time Andrew Tate was sort of on the rise, she kind of began questioning, maybe this isn't this, because she was in a lot of ways a mouthpiece for this latter group that seemed to be almost recognizing maybe this is going to a very bad place. And I actually looked it up just now on her YouTube channel. The video the thumbnail that's being highlighted here is her recent interview with, oh no, it's 3 years ago, but the one she highlights is her interview with Curtis Yarvin. So maybe nothing has changed. I don't know. But it got me to thinking when she said that, like, how much of this, you and I are young, we're both millennials. You occupy a lot of young spaces with, say, Gen Zers. God bless you. You go into this, you go into these groups and meetings, and you, submerge yourself, I guess, to a certain degree within this culture in a lot of ways. People like me are just more digitally facing. But how much of this could be forgiven for a person saying, look, 100 years from now, we've seen this before. Yeah, the young get kind of radical, they get a little restless, but eventually they marry, they have kids, they settle down, they pay taxes. And it was fun while it lasted. That kind of, Irving Kristol even talks about, even though he was the father of neoconservatism, that in his earlier Trotskyite days, it was almost like your first love in high school or middle school. You never quite get over that romanticism of it, even though you've matured out of it. This kind of radical ideology, if you will. How much of this is just going to run its course, or how much of this is truly something new?
It's hard to say, but I mean, the idea of something new, we've seen in the past examples of young people being radicalized and fully taking over the politics of a country, right? And it taking the country into really dark, dangerous places. I mean, this is the story of the rise of fascism in the early 20th century, and communism as well, by the way, in the 20th
Yeah,
century.
yeah.
And so, I think that there are examples in which this sort of thing runs its course, and there are examples from history in which it doesn't, in which, right? So I don't know which of those is in our future. I think the thing that makes me hopeful is that I do see, in the same way that I think the woke left really overplayed its hand, right? It went so hard into militant, illiberal policing of society according to its values, trying to impose its way of life on everyone, whether they like it or not. It created a political backlash, right? It led people who would otherwise not be fans of Donald Trump to say, well, I think he's actually the lesser of two evils now, and to vote for him. And we're now seeing a sort of radical rethinking and rolling back of things like the DEI initiatives across society. And just generally speaking, I think most people recognize that wokeness peaked, and we're now living through a correction, right? The society is correcting. And I expect that something similar will probably happen with the right wing overreach. I think right now we're seeing, I mean, even just in terms of pure policy, we saw Donald Trump come into office in January with the economy and immigration as his top two issues. These were the things that people trusted him on. They were the things that he ran on. And what we've seen is that the policies he's implemented have been so radical and have so undermined. I mean, on the economic issue, he's actually made the problem worse, right? Prices, people do not feel like affordability is getting better. It's getting worse because of
It's
tariffs.
shocking that the trade war didn't make things better.
Right. And on immigration, they supported actually a crackdown on immigration. They supported, in many cases, mass deportations, but they didn't support it being done in the way that it is being done right now, where people are being literally like tackled to the ground and thrown in the back of unmarked vehicles and held in captivity without access to a lawyer, and people are no idea where their family members are, and American citizens are being, caught up in this. We now have people walking down the streets of major cities asking papers please, as if this is a normal thing in a free society. We have obviously people who have been sent to gulags in under foreign dictatorships, even after having court orders saying that can't happen. Like, the rule of law and the chaos around the way in which the immigration crackdown has been happening has really undermined. I mean, Donald Trump is now underwater in terms of his public opinion, his support on this issue. It was one of his two strongest issues, and now people are more unfavorable than favorable about his handling of immigration and economics and everything else as well, because those were his two best issues. So he's now underwater on everything basically. And so what we can see is that when people overreach, when they go too hard, too far, too fast, there is a natural correction that in a free society can happen. Market corrections, political corrections, the sort of fever breaking, and people realizing, okay, this was a mistake. People who had come over into the Trump coalition or into the Republican Party because they were reacting against the extreme left, now moving back out of the Republican coalition because they're like, okay, this is not what I was signing up for. I am not okay with this. So there are multiple mechanisms in a free society in which we can see corrections take place. that's what gives me hope. What makes me nervous is that the more we break our institutions, right, the more we erode norms and break institutions, the harder it is for those corrections to occur naturally, the way they naturally should, and we hope they will. If you have the Department of Justice that has just been captured by one side and is being used purely to go after the enemies of the president, it makes it much harder. I mean, these are the kinds of things that actually do interfere, can interfere. If we have interference in the upcoming elections, in the midterms, and in the next presidential election, I mean, that's the kind of thing that can stop the natural correction of the swing that happens, the sort of pendulum
Right.
going back and forth, if we have government interfering to stop those things. But I'm not, and I do worry. I worry more about those very extreme possibilities that would have seemed crazy to me 10 or 15 years ago. I now worry much more about them than I once did. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think that we still have a lot of there's a lot of one of the things that the polls consistently find is that Americans care a lot about individual rights and liberties, right? We want to live in a free society. Most people do not hate those who are on the other side of the aisle from them. The number of people who do hate those on the other side of the aisle is going up, and that's worrying. But it's still a small minority, right? Most of us do not hate our political opponents. Most of us want to live in a sort of peaceful, free society, and so that's what we have going for us. I think I'm hopeful that we just kind of are going to have to muddle through this the way we muddled through other crises in the past, and that it will be okay in the end.
Yeah, and I think I share your, let's say, hope. I don't have unfettered optimism that that's what's going to happen. I mean, I think if anything, our Christian backgrounds teach us that it's not, the future's not guaranteed. Bad things can happen, but one can hope too. And we have a certain responsibility or maybe participation in that process, however tiny they may be. Some days. I wanted to ask, though, perhaps in closing, because I've hinted at, you've had boots on the ground in a lot of these groups, and been to national or the NatCon conventions multiple times. I suspect you probably don't hang out in too many Bronze Age pervert fan clubs, but within some of these organizations, and I'm just curious from a personal level, what has your experience been as far as um, do these various groups treat you, because obviously some people have got to know who Stephanie Slade is, that she's not she's not our cheerleader, if you will. Do they treat you as sort of a curiosity, as someone? Do they want to tangle with you in a friendly, say, debate style? Are you the enemy within? Like, how are you perceived when you show up in these various places?
That is an interesting question. As is often the case, I find that people are nicer in person than they are online. So sometimes I will go to one of these conferences, and I'll people will say hi to me in the hallway outside of the ballroom or whatever, and then they'll be pretty mean to me when I write the article, and they don't like what I've said about it on Twitter, right? That this is kind of the way the world works these days. I don't get necessarily invited to the Christmas parties that these groups are putting on, and I do think I wrote something pretty harsh about this last NatCon. I was a little reluctant to do it, but I felt like it was necessary to write. I do think national conservatism has an anti-Semitism problem, and it needs to grapple with that. And for a long time, they've coasted on the fact that their founder, Yoram Hazony, is an Israeli Jew. And so he would be able to go out there and say, obviously, NatCons aren't anti-Semitic. Are you crazy? Like, I'm the founder of this. They couldn't possibly be. But even he acknowledged during his speech at the conference that anti-Semitic sentiments are on the rise, and that that this is sort of, he didn't say this, but it's true that there is a lot of the young people who are associated with the national conservatism movement who are dabbling in these ideas, and in some cases outwardly, openly advocating them. And so I wrote this piece after the last NatCon conference, and then I said to my boss, I don't know if they're going to give me a press credential for the next one. I honestly don't know if they're going to let me come back. We'll have to wait and see. I hope so. So far, they have allowed me to come to all of them. I've applied for a press credential, and they've allowed me in, even though I've continually written critical things about what their beliefs are. We will see if that continues. I'm curious actually to see what happens next time around.
Yeah, I mean, we live in an era where I think sometimes it's, if a group's smart, it's sometimes to their benefit to have people writing critical things about them because that gets more reactions than if everything's a fluff piece, if you will. Um, Stephanie, it would be unfair of me to ask just what's the solution. You've already kind of alluded to what's the hope here. I definitely want to have you back in the future when does the book you've written have a working title yet?
Yes. The title of my book, unless something changes in the next 8 months, is going to be Fusionism, Liberty, Virtue, and the Future of the American Right. And it's going to be published by the University of Notre Dame Press. And I just got the publication date of September 1st, 2026. So I'm excited about that.
Very excited as well. I'm a huge fan of fusionism. I'm a huge fan of your work, and in a lot of ways, I think maybe we could save this for a part two. What is the, let's call it, classical libertarian / conservative response to a lot of these things? I think can be found in the old Frank Meyer arguments of fusionism, which we could flesh out more there. But I'll close with that. I have always profited from your writings and the last time we had you on, you set the record straight on what fusionism was. Again, a little teaser there for maybe the next time. But Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the Saving Elephant Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.